Thank you for joining CSIS's Project on Prosperity and Development for Day 1 of the 6th Annual Global Development Forum. During Day 1 of GDF, we'll explain why increased development finance is necessary to support the clean energy transition. We'll also explore how the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted manufacturing and exposed the vulnerabilities of global value chains. Finally, we'll examine how U.S. attempts to reduce its dependence on Chinese manufacturing and supply chains may require both reshoring and nearshoring to the Americas or elsewhere. We hope you enjoy this year's Global Development Forum.
Good morning. My name is Dan Rundy. I'm a Senior Vice President here at CSIS. I also hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. Welcome to the 6th Annual Global Development Forum. We're excited to be back this year after a hiatus last year due to COVID-19. We have a great schedule today. Our first panel looks at opportunities for nearshoring to the Americas and the role of global development in that context. The second panel looks at how we can achieve a clean energy transition and what's the role of global development in the clean energy transition. We'll close today with a keynote conversation from the President of the Dominican Republic, President Luis Abinader. Day 2 will kick off at 9 a.m. tomorrow with a fireside chat with Michelle Sumelis, who is Assistant Administrator for Policy Planning and Learning at USAID. I want to thank the Chevron Corporation for over 10 years of generous support. Their support has enabled the Global Development Forum and our research on important topics in global development that we wouldn't have been able to take on without them. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Project on Prosperity and Development for their very hard work in pulling this event together. I want to particularly thank my colleague Shannon McCune, who's done really great work making this all happen and doing all this in a virtual environment. I'm now going to hand the floor over to my friend, Meredith Broadbent, who's a senior advisor here at CSIS for this great panel. Thanks everybody for joining us. Meredith, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I want to welcome you to CSIS virtually for our first panel in the 2021 Global Development Forum. This morning, we are going to wrestle with the issue of whether the dramatic disruption of global supply chains that is being felt in every region of the United States and the world economy will prompt coherent policy responses by governments and coherent marketplace decisions by companies, which will support the reshoring of manufacturing production to the United States and trading partners within the Western Hemisphere. We have an excellent panel today to review the situation facing the trading system from 4 very different angles. And we are going to start today with Fabrizio Apparetti, who's Manager, Integration and Trade Sector at the Inter-American Development Bank. And he's an expert and technical assistant supporting regional initiatives and capacity building programs, as well as several public-private policy dialogues. And just to preview our other speakers, Tatiana Prazeres, who is a senior fellow, University of the International Business and Economics Department in Beijing, and former Secretary of Foreign Trade, Brazil. She's had also experience in the World Trade Organization. Our third speaker will be Nazak Nakatir, partner at Wiley Ryan and a recent Assistant Secretary at the Department of Commerce for International Trade and National Security. And finally, we will conclude with a private sector representative from Edwards Life Sciences, Omar Jimenez, who can give us a sense of how the private sector is assessing the global trends. So if we could start this morning with Fabrizio, and maybe you could give us your overview of some of the disruptions that the international economy is facing.
Thank you so much, Meredith. Thank you, Dan, for the invitation. Good morning to everyone, to all the audience. It's a pleasure to be part of this very important Global Development Forum representing the Inter-American Development Bank, and also thank the CSIS for the invitation. We believe that the topic at hand here that we're analyzing and that brings us together, which is the reconfiguration of value chains, the regionalization of value chains, if you'd like, is a key topic for economic development for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the region where the IDB acts. It's key for economic recovery. Employment generation, which is at the center stage of our new vision 2025 under President Carone, puts the creation of high quality and better paying jobs at the forefront of this strategy. And we see how we think that this incipient shifts in the value chains really afford a unique opportunity for the region to recover and to grow. But as Meredith suggested, this will not materialize automatically. This will require policies, smart policies, and also investments by the private sector in the region. The decision to locate a part of a company's supply chain to a nearby country may involve both investments to either open or expand subsidiaries abroad, as well as the development of new unaffiliated suppliers from where to source those inputs. And this boosts both output and employment, of course, in that country. And let me just give you a few reasons for why we think this is very important. Increasing participation in global value chains increases productivity. In Latin America and the Caribbean, growth since 2000 has been derived from has been driven by labor force and not by productivity growth. And it is shown and again and again that the insertion of a country in a value chain, regional or global, contributes to that productivity. Second, what we were saying before, this is an employment generator investment, and there has been very interesting analysis that it's an employment generator for women in particular. So in these employment opportunities, women even benefit more, and we know that disparity in the region that we also want to address. Bringing the value chains closer to the markets also is good for the environment because the carbon footprint and water footprint and the like undoubtedly is reduced. And finally, the economic impact, which is what we have been analyzing, is huge. Our studies suggest that if Latin America and the Caribbean were to position itself as the source of 10% of US imports from its largest sources outside of the region, it could expand goods exports in the region by 70 billion a year. That's the value at play. And this accounts for the goods that the region already exports to the United States. So it's not creating new exports, but rather increasing that base. And This is not just theory, Meredith. We're seeing this happen. 2020 survey from Gartner notes that more than a third of 260 leading global companies are planning to shift their supply chains to alternative suppliers in the coming years. The UBS Evidence Lab pointed out that more than 75% of US companies with manufacturing facilities abroad have decided or are considering relocating. And there are so many examples that we're seeing every day. IBM opened its largest process transformation center in Bogota. Intel announced a $600 million investment in Costa Rica to manufacture microprocessors. So we see increasingly this opportunity. We have to lower the trade costs. We have to better integrate. But I can address that a little later.
Thank you very much. What do you think is the most compelling statistic? Rattling off those studies a little bit more. I mean, what are you most focused on?
We're focused on the costs of trade, the trade cost, because this is in a way it's circumstantial. It's a circumstance in history, but the structural versus the circumstantial is what we have to address. Our transportation and logistics costs are 30% higher than in the OECD countries. The information costs of our goods and services also are detrimental. The regulatory costs. So that we think is what we need to address, those structural costs of trade. But we have been developing strategies at the national level. And we're finding, for example, in Jamaica, concrete opportunities for business and knowledge process outsourcing over the short term, and warehousing, transshipment, manufacturing in the medium term. Uruguay, my country, where I just arrived from Paraguay, and I'm on work mission right now. We're starting to travel to see our clients. Has big opportunities in software development, audiovisual services, also pharmaceutical, shared service center. Honduras, textile and line manufacturing. Colombia, food manufacturing, automotive, steel making. These are all sectors in which we see increasingly opportunities, investments. And of course, we have to, as we're saying, this won't materialize automatically. We like to talk about the 3 I's in order to intervene. The I of investment, the eye of infrastructure, the eye of integration. And if we focus our efforts, and that's what we're doing from the IDB, to look at the restrictive trade policies, which include low levels of harmonization of technical standards and regulations. We have to work on that integration. We have to work on the trade infrastructure to lower transportation costs. As we were saying, logistics costs in the region account for 16 to 26% of regional GDP. That's less than 9% in the OECD countries. So that trade infrastructure, better airports, roads, border crossings, digital connectivity, those opportunities won't materialize if we don't lower those costs. By the way, those are opportunities for private investment as well, or public-private partnerships. So there's also an opportunity in lowering those barriers. The high information costs associated, of course, with the reliable data we need on contacts, on regulations, on requisites for doing business. We launched Connect Americas, a platform for SME business in the Americas. 7 years ago, it has 8 million users from around the world. It's the type of initiative that we have to also promote to lower those information costs. And also the access to financing, right? The access, there's a gap there in the region, Latin America. The financing to the private sector in Latin America accounts for 56% of GDP, compared to 133% globally. So we have to secure those sources of financing for the private sector, and especially for small and medium companies that will be the suppliers of those supply chains, that will be the suppliers of those big companies that can invest in the region and can better integrate with the United States.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tatiana, welcome. And from your perspective as having experience in as an advisor to the Secretary of Foreign Trade in Brazil and at the World Trade Organization, and now from your teaching post in Beijing, what do you see are the important trends and drivers at this point going on in the global economy?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Pleasure to be with all of you today. Let me start by saying that issues related to resilience of supply chains and reliance on fuel sources, of course, have emerged as key concerns following the pandemic. Companies are certainly looking more at the risks in their international production processes as a result of COVID, as well as shortages, logistic disruptions, bottlenecks, etc., that followed suit. There's a lot of talk about just in time versus just in case. A lot of talk about resilience and redundancy instead of efficiency alone. But I think that ultimately sourcing still is a business decision unless governments want otherwise, right? So that is very important. Governments can provide incentives for companies to reshore, to nearshore, to diversify suppliers. As Fabrizio mentioned, governments can put in place the right policy framework to promote integration, infrastructure, lower trade costs, etc., etc. So governments have the tools to affect business decisions, business calculus. And we saw in efforts to bring production back home, US and Japan, for example, taking measures in that regard. But ultimately, the business logic will ultimately prevail in supply chain decisions. So in thinking about nearshoring, I wonder why being geographically closer means a safer bet for value chains. What is that being near means being better in the context of diversification? We all understand that resilience may come in the form of diversifying your sources of supply, in avoiding concentration in one supplier. But what is it that being near increases or reduces your risks, right? It increases your resilience. To what extent doesn't proximity provide a false sense of security, of reliability to supply chain? So that's something that we need to think about because there's a risk that there's a bit of a hype related to nearshoring. Of course, there is something, and to be sure here, about changes in supply chains. But what is that being near really adds to the concerns that are driving these changes to supply chains? Think about hurricanes or floods disrupting production or political instability. That can happen near or far, right? So nearshoring does not protect against natural disasters or political upheavals or an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, for example. So the risk is replacing one type of vulnerability for another. And of course, there are cases where near is better, right? Near can be better if logistics and transportation costs and time, etc., can be significantly reduced. That, of course, makes a difference. Being near can help if there's a trade agreement, reducing tariffs, reducing regulatory barriers to trade. But it's not the physical proximity itself, it's the agreement, right? Which may or may not involve neighbors. I think we're yet to see how much of reshoring and nearshoring will stand the test of businesses, which will ultimately keep seeking for these cost-effective supply solutions. And to be sure, disruptions really are forcing companies to explore alternatives and mitigate risks, as Fabrizio mentioned. There's a push towards shortening supply chains, to regionalize supply chains, to allow for greater control and oversight over production facilities. I think we talk a lot about a decision to offshore, to reshore, to nearshore, but there's something that strikes me as correct. I think companies and businesses are looking at right-shoring, and that may not be nearshoring. So I think the region, if you think, I come from Brazil myself, if you think about the region, what are the right policy framework that you need to put in place to really make sure that countries in Latin America, Brazil, could benefit from the opportunities created for companies looking around to right shore. So I think that would be my initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. So the point that was made by the first panelist about a benefit to the environment, you wouldn't see that as much of a plus for reshoring to the Western Hemisphere from Asia.
Well, I lost my connection. I was on and off, but I think proximity can make a difference if you think about transportation and emissions related to transportation, for example. I don't know what point was made related to the environment, but anything that distance and time has an effect in supplying, then of course nearshoring would make sense. But my fundamental question here is, what are the drivers forcing companies to rethink their sourcing decisions, right? Their location decisions, and what is that about bringing production near home, not home, but near home, make supply chains more resilient, more reliable?
Thank you. Nazak, as a partner at Wiley Ryan these days, and based on your experience at the Commerce Department, what is your sense of the trends going on in the international economy? Do companies really want to move away from China and Asia in favor of reshoring in the Western Hemisphere?
Thank you, and perfect question. So for starters, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I want to start answering that with a quote from Adam Smith. Even he, the father of free trade, noted that it was undesirable for a country to become dependent on imports. In the words of Smith, quote, it is of importance that the kingdom depend as little as possible upon its neighbors for the manufactures necessary for defense. So we ignored this principle for a long time, but now finally we've learned from the pandemic that borders matter, because any sovereign state has the right and ability to restrict exports to the rest of the world. Okay, so where do we go from here? The problem continues to be increasingly complex. Today, we are, as you well know, in the midst of a global supply chain crisis as we're dealing with port closures, insufficient shipments of cargoes, worker shortages at plants, ports and warehouses, worker shortages, shipping container supply contractions, and inadequate domestic infrastructure and workers to move what currently exists. All this plus surging energy costs have caused shortages and commodity prices to skyrocket. And with the Delta variant, the expectation is that these disruptions are going to continue into next year likely, and will hold up inflation longer than originally thought. Inflation in America is at a high of 5.2 to 5.4%. That's more than double the century average of 2.2%. And in August of this year, America hit our highest, the US hit our highest trade deficit level, surging by an increase of 4.2% from the prior month to 73.3 billion. Again, that's the highest since the government started tracking deficits. But today, approximately 70% of businesses believe that supply chains have become too global and need to become more regional. Okay, so where do we go from here? For starters, we're focused on onshoring and nearshoring because we can control closer supply chains. Okay, all of this is a good start, but our policies have to be smart. And my position is that we're not there yet. Let's take the infrastructure bill as an example. While there are a lot of good pieces there, the bill falls short of being complete in several respects. One, we haven't solved our upstream vulnerabilities. If we're going to build plants at home, we need access to the raw materials to manufacture. Most of these come from China. We need to onshore and nearshore those as well. Two, we've underestimated the costs that will be needed to bring supply chains home or near home. And three, we haven't figured out our downstream points of vulnerability either. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we invest in semiconductor plants here to eliminate our dependence on Southeast Asia. Let's see if that's enough. Well, we're still dependent on China for the critical minerals and for the chemicals that we need to manufacture both the chips and the equipment to make the chips. Without access to the upstream supply chains, our $52 billion CHIP Act investment will produce virtually nothing of value. Then, even if we produce the chips and Taiwan produces the chips here, can we use the chips straight off the production line? Likely not, because the chips will still have to return to Southeast Asia for assembly, packaging, and testing. Again, our vulnerabilities remain. But we have the Latin America and the Caribbean. In the last administration, we launched the American Cresay initiative that works with these countries to help develop the legal framework to strengthen their infrastructure in order to attract US investments. This is a great starting point. Why don't we also get the Development Finance Corporation and the EXIM Bank to further fund projects in nearby countries where we can have semiconductor assembly, testing, and packaging and manufacture as well? The Defense Production Act permits investments in Canada. Let's consider legislation that expands this authority to other nearshore investments as well. Let me emphasize, while we're not adequately investing in these countries right now, China is. Its footprint is increasing while ours is weakening. A final example is lithium-ion batteries. China controls 80 to 90% of the lithium-ion cell supply chain, but it doesn't need to. We in the United States have robust manufacturing capabilities, just not the lithium-ion cells. But we can bring that to the United States in just 2 years. We can also bring that to our southern partners as well. Another benefit of having cells and other upstream products produced in our neighboring countries, including South America, is the opportunities for those countries to tap into their rich mineral reserves, like lithium, for the North and South American supply chains. And we can create free trade zones and develop cross-border tax incentives to use products from our neighbors rather than adversaries. Look, we've spent 30 plus years offshoring our supply chains. Let's spend the next years bringing them home to the US and to our allies. My point is that if we have the ability, to do so if we plan thoroughly. We're not there yet, but I hope with discussions like this, we'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazak. That was helpful. Omar, I'd like to switch to you as being a full-fledged representative of the private sector here that's involved in manufacturing in the Latin American region. You joined Edwards Life Sciences in 2012, and it's a medical technology company that's headquartered in Irvine, California, but which has production facilities in several different countries, particularly in Latin America. And wondered if you had some perspectives on what kind of government policies would be helpful to your facilities in terms of relocating more manufacturing either to the United States or to Latin America.
Sure. Thanks, Meredith. Before getting into the question, first, I want to also highlight that I'm the General Coordinator of the Medical Device Cluster Manufacturers in DR. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the whole sector, not just Edwards.
Omar, could you say that again? You're the coordinator for what?
The medical device cluster for the Dominican Republic manufacturers. So I'm also going to be talking on the whole sector, medtech sector, not just Edwards. So it is important to highlight that. But we want to thank first on behalf of the cluster and Adosona, our parent association, the invitation today, Dan and Meredith. So I want to take an approach on 3 periods that I want to examine with you before answering that. First, the pre-COVID landscape during the pandemic and the new reality that we're seeing now and future steps that you all discuss. First, before the pandemic, it is important to highlight in the manufacturing sectors, several trends were being observed many years before that yielded some benefits like what we are discussing today, nearshoring or reshoring. These initiatives were targeted at reducing lead times to end customers, warehousing and space and cost, faster resolution of quality issues, business continuity, among others. You might know those initiatives with one of the following names, such as localization, vertical integration, lead time reductions, and business continuity plans. And this initiative arose from the fact that several of the supply chains were very complex and scattered around the globe. However, something important is that these initiatives were not done because of a concerted effort of a region or a country, but individual companies, and were done by a small percentage of them. In addition, many decades ago, most manufacturing used the lean approach to minimize inventory on hand, taking into consideration inventories in transit, and we were relying too much on the manufacturer. And this was because we thought we had good connectivity across the world. And now we know that with the pandemic, we don't have that good connectivity. So in summary, the point I'm trying to make on this portion is that before the pandemic began, things were happening already along the lines of what we're trying to discuss today. So during the pandemic, and I'll be brief because most of you have talked about this, but we know supply chain was completely disrupted and even stopped in some areas and regions. In addition, other big issues happened with manufacturers as Tatiana mentioned, like fires and storms that cause additional disruption. And then on the other hand, we know the demand went skyrocketed in many of the areas that we have today, such as the medical needs and electronics and supply. So when the companies started to reopen, we know we faces the issues of lack of workers, that we don't have enough workers now, congestion in ports, lack of trucks for transportation, among many others. So these issues and others have caused the sector, the medtech sector, and many other companies, the highest inflation we've seen in many decades among a variety of commodities and services. And for instance, freight was referred earlier today. But as a reference, most companies are paying up to 10x the cost before the pandemic in freight. A 40-foot container is costing more than $20,000 US dollars now to be able to ship. Amazing, an amazing amount. We never thought in our wildest dream we will pay. What some companies are doing to mitigate this? Some of the big ones have acquired vessels and containers or chartering ships to ensure their goods arrive on time. However, what is the reality? Not all the companies have the luxury to take the action like those. As we know, medium and small companies have a higher risk of not being able to support this kind of increases given their capitals, leaving them with the option of passing the increases to the customer, or even worse, reduction or closing their operations. So as Nasak mentioned, chips is also very scarce. Really high premiums we are paying right now. And even with the high premiums, sometimes we don't even find the chips. So that's why some countries are investing billions of dollars to bring that. So the point here is that even though the pandemic exponentially exacerbated the issues, it was not the only cause. We were already observing these issues before the pandemic, but with the pandemic, that was the perfect storm to make it happen. So to your question, Meredith, what is the new reality? As we've talked here, most experts predict that the end of these issues are not even close to resolution, and that it might never go back to what it was before the pandemic. So we need to adapt quickly to this new reality to meet our ends, and this is where this discussion comes in. We have to rethink our supply chain, but as Tatiana and Nasak mentioned, we have to learn from the past. And what I mean the past is before the pandemic, plus learnings of optimizing and applying lean manufacturing on different ways. We've learned now that the way we were implementing lean manufacturing is probably not the best. So this is where nearshoring in the Americas region can play a critical role to keep improving reliability and resilience on the firms serving the US market. Depending on the type of good used, and this is a very important point that Tatiana referred, there will always be some kind of supply chain that crosses hemispheres, because there is a big reliance on some key raw materials that are only found on some of the Asia region. So we have to be smart. We cannot just go and do things because now we want to be near. We need to make sure we develop our supply chain in a smart way with these learnings that we have. So we believe we should focus on 4 pillars. The first one is education in the Americas region. For instance, in the medtech sector, we've been evolving and moving from more labor operations to more technological operations. So this requires different skills. The infrastructure, you guys have mentioned the infrastructures. We need to build better ports, clean energy, airports, and roads to be able to tackle that. Training and regulatory requirements are very important. As you know, to serve the US, many regulations have to be compliant, and not all the countries are in the capacity to comply with that. And finally, as you guys have suggested, this has to go along with having the proper government long-term legislations and policy in place. And the highlight this is the long-term legislations. It cannot be a period of 3, 4, 5 years. It has to be long-term. And also legislations that encourage people to work. As you know, we've seen, unfortunately, people not necessarily want to work these days. So in summary, we know it's not an easy task, Meredith, as you asked, but it will take some time. Big investments, but with support of institutions such as the CSIS, the governments, and the companies, we can take it. So thank you.
Thank you, Omar. As your company considers potentially reshoring some manufacturing to the United States, what are the considerations that loom large?
Well, considerations first, we need to make sure we have the right talent. In the past, probably cost was one of the biggest reasons to reshore some companies or to go to other places. But talent is the number one in our sector right now. We have very specific skill sets that we need for doing these very specific processes. So talent is the number one. The second one is having the right infrastructure, connectivity, ports, lanes to connect with the US and in a very fast way. Then the other one will be the legislations in place. We need to make sure the legislations in place in these countries are fomenting the investment, but also that are long-term. Because sometimes some countries changes the legislation 5 years on the road, but these investments, very big investments, are planned for 30, 40 years. So those are the things that we need to take into consideration to continue evaluating the reshoring.
Great, thank you. I wanted to give the panelists a chance to respond to maybe what the other three speakers said, if anyone has anything they'd like, any points they would like to make.
Yeah, if I can observe on the last comments about human capital. That is key. If we're talking about investment and high value added, I fully agree, what our colleague was saying about that. There's full employment in technology. There's full employment and attrition. That happens in Silicon Valley and happens in Medellin and happens in Uruguay. The companies fight amongst each other to go for that human capital. That raises, of course, the costs, and we have to work on that. And I think there is an opportunity to work closely with the United States on this. At the IDB, we have a program with MIT here in Uruguay on data science, on a master's in data science, which is run by the Technological University of Uruguay, but sponsored by MIT, and the curricula we built together with the private sector and MIT. Every graduate in that program is working in international companies. This is the things that we have to scale up in the region. The US helped to contribute to develop the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technologies, back in the 60s with USAID support, actually. We probably need more of that. The CEO of Google went to an IIT. We need more of that connection. It's trade, but it's also culture, it's education, it's sports, and those are not light words. It's not only a soft side not connected to the bottom line. There is in that mobility is when business occurs. So I'm all for that human capital development and integration and more programs with the US and the region.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to comment on another speaker's?
Yeah, this is Nizak. So I wanted to make 2 points. I think one of the issues we've had with education is that if there are insufficient jobs, right, if there's insufficient R&D development, because all of these things have offshored, of course, we are going to see sort of less education disciplines in these fields. So hopefully, of course, the emphasis must be on education. And hopefully, if we create adequate job opportunities in the United States and within our nearshore allies, we could see a positive improvement in education as well. But I want to underscore something really, really important. When we onshore and when we actually put critical supply chains in our allies, countries near shore, let's remember what happened during the pandemic so we can make sure this never happens again. Allies started imposing export controls and started our export restrictions and started restricting access to PPE to one another. So if we're going to do this, and if we're going to do this properly, we need to also understand 4 things. We should make binding agreements with our partners where we're putting critical supply chains. And those binding agreements should, 1, prevent export restrictions on things that we all need, the ecosystem needs. 2, those countries have to adequately leverage their trade remedy laws to prevent imports from eroding the supply chains that they have there that we're relying on. 3, they need an adequate export review mechanism, or import investment review mechanism, like we have in the United States through the CFIUS mechanism. So they make sure that there's no predatory import investments, predatory foreign direct investments that weaken the supply chains, again, that we're relying on. And finally, we have to put in our binding agreements the definition of essential workers. So to the extent that there's another catastrophe, they define essential workers very much the same way as we do and the ecosystem does, so we can continue to leverage each other's supply chains, even during times of crisis. Thank you.
Tatiana, did you have any comments, maybe from Brazil's perspective as one of the other larger economies in the hemisphere?
Actually, I was planning to comment on China, so maybe let me do that, and then I can come back to Brazil in a second. There have been a couple of comments on China, and I've been living here for 3 years, working with some Chinese colleagues at the university, thinking about trade and disruptions associated with trade from China. So there's a lot of talk about production moving away from China, moving out of China, and discussions about why. And I think, costs, of course, is a key reason. This has been well documented. Labor cost has been playing a role in moving production out of China for more than a decade now. But it's important to note that labor costs are increasingly less important in location decisions, right? So productivity will depend more on other factors than on labor costs. Then what we see more recently is China's own policies and regulatory changes affecting several sectors here. So changes in the tech sector, educational sector, cryptocurrencies, real estate sectors that rely heavily on algorithms, on personal data, et cetera. So all that is, of course, very new, and it's early to tell the impact in the economy and business perceptions on whether they want to remain in China or they may want to relocate. And then there's this geopolitical concerns, and I think a bit of that has been in our panel, U.S.-China tensions in particular. And it's interesting to note, of course, you have all kinds of surveys, et cetera, but quite reliable ones, I would say. EU chamber in China, U.S. chamber in Shanghai, et cetera. And the overwhelming majority of European and American companies have no plans to leave China in the next 3 to 5 years. So surely companies have to adapt, adjust, sometimes to avoid US sanctions or higher tariffs. Companies that have value chains centered in China are considering moving part of their sourcing away from the country, etc. But the perception is that they want to do that just enough to circumvent or to avoid restrictive trade measures. The question is, can companies afford not to be in China? Many companies follow this approach called in China for China. So maybe they came for the workers, now they stay for the consumers. They also stay for the sourcing options. Overall, I think it's a bit unrealistic to expect a mass exodus from China. But outside China, what I see is more companies considering this China +1 strategy. So that is gaining popularity, I would say. Many companies consider that, well, in addition to China, it is worth the costs of having an additional different sourcing option. So I think just to give a perception from someone, a non-Chinese being in China and following these discussions about supply chain and investments moving out of China. So that would be my comment now.
Okay, and then Omar, did you have anything to add, or should we go to our next question?
Yes, I just wanted to, what Tatiana just mentioned, like that's correct. We agree that it won't be a mass exodus. What we need to make sure we work is in something for the regions that we are trying to serve. Like, not everyone is serving China. Maybe other companies are serving Brazil, for instance. So why do we need to be in China to manufacture that? So that, I guess that's the question. And also, what is the infrastructure? Because what we learned with the pandemic is that everything was working fine, but now there is no ports, there is no connectivity. So how we solve for that connectivity, I think it's going to be a big question for companies to be able to stay. I'm not talking about China. It's the other side of the world where the consumer is. Like, let's talk about China consumers. If the manufacturer is in the US, the same question applies, is how are we going to bring the goods to China from the US? So thank you.
And then one quick comment I wanted to make is that, you know, when I advise companies, I always sort of emphasize the fact that if you want to stay in China right now, it's fine, but just make sure that you have contingency plans when, with China's growing crackdown on operations, you're no longer able to supply there. So it's fine now, but have a backup plan because your time span in China will be limited.
Great, thank you. Fabrizio, I'd like to start with you on a question we had related to what potential countries and sectors in the Americas have the highest likelihood of nearshoring.
Yes, thanks, Meredith. I also would like to point out, this is not a question of, you know, bringing back from China. It's a question of, in the region, of attracting investment. India, actually, TCS, Tata Consulting Services, set up shop in Latin America 20 years ago and increased ever since. And they're doing software development and services. And so it's a variety of sectors, and it's a variety of countries. Audiovisual sector in Uruguay, Netflix and started filming here. There's huge opportunity for that. You need more people though. You know, we come back to the people. We're working with a New York Film Academy to train audiovisual specialists in Uruguay because there's lack of people. We want to actually get more talent from abroad in this country. Jamaica and the Caribbean, we're saying business process outsourcing, BPO 2.0, which is different with technology. Many things are automated, and the film industry as well, and transshipment manufacturing. Colombia presents various opportunities in both short and medium term, and there's manufacturing as well, auto parts, electrical equipment, services. In Medellin, there's a center for the fourth industrial revolution there, and there's a huge cluster of professional services there as well, because we have to think not only goods, right? We have to think services, which is very important, and it's a whole different ball game. Instead, in terms of data protection, policies that safeguard intellectual property and the like. The Dominican Republic, our colleague, you know, there's medical devices, cables, textiles, footwear, in all sectors that are important. So there's a diversity. We're taking deep dives. This is just 30,000 feet, but in each of the countries, in each of the 26 borrowing beneficiary countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, we're working on national promotion strategies. We're organizing a trade and investment fora to disseminate those strategies amongst the private sector. We coordinate the Americas Business Dialogue. As you know, next year is the Summit of the Americas in the US. We hope to support the CEO Summit, and hopefully those opportunities will materialize into specific investments.
Great. Fabrizio, is the region have opportunity to develop raw materials production? Nazik mentioned that we are dependent, the hemisphere is dependent on China for many raw materials.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because, for example, with the electric batteries and you know, yeah, amongst the largest reserves of lithium are in Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. But if the batteries are not produced near the lithium, it's not competitive. So it's in raw materials with upstream and downstream and value added, and so that's the type of thing that can be very aspirational. But you know, we're developing a study on this on lithium and electric batteries. With what's going on in the world with electric vehicles, undoubtedly there's a future, but our transportation costs are too high in order to export and extract that lithium and sell it very far if you don't have the productive capabilities near in this case, the lithium. So I think, and that value added is what we need, and that requires incentives, that requires human capital. We have to look at the incentives as well. With the global taxation right now, global tax reform that's going on, we have to take a new view and update our incentive regimes, like the free trade zones, like the maquiladoras. We have to adapt to these new conditions as well. So again, we like to say it won't materialize completely, but the great liberalization that occurred in Latin America between 1990 and 2010 contributed to 60% of the yearly per capita income growth in the region. Trade contributes to economic growth. Trade is anti-cyclical when there are crises like the ones we are having right now. But we have to work on policies, on promotion, on trade infrastructure. It won't materialize alone. And there's no panacea on this. There's no shortcuts. We have to work on the structural. There are opportunities, yes. The COVID crisis made us aware of that, accelerated the digital transformation, created in many ways opportunities, but they won't materialize automatically.
All right.
And I wanted to just underscore 2 points. One is, look, we're 80% reliant on China on critical minerals processing and 90% on the rare earth subset. Part of what we haven't adequately done in the United States, and I would say globally, is adequately track the other mineable reserves in other countries. We do have some data on reserves, not completely for all critical minerals, but we haven't looked at mineable reserves. And we haven't really cracked the code on clean processing and better extraction from what's on the mines. If we do something analogous to Operation Warp Speed, whether you like the name or not, with our allies to sort of figure this out, I think we can relieve ourselves of much of our critical mineral vulnerabilities. And to Fabrizio's point and my earlier point, it makes no sense that we wouldn't have lithium ion cell production in Latin America, the Caribbean, South America. The supply chain makes sense, the labor force makes sense, and just from purely the standpoint of accessing the reserves that exist there, of course it makes sense. And finally, incentives, as Fabrizio mentioned and as I had mentioned earlier, are completely appropriate. We could offer tax incentives across the North and South American regions for companies that produce in their downstream product the upstream inputs that incorporate the upstream inputs from North America and South America. That will also incentivize bringing the downstream electronic sector more into our regions. There are solutions, but that's why I'm hoping that discussions like this help inform the policymakers of not just admiring the problems, but actually implementing realistic solutions.
Okay, thank you. Wanted to switch to the question of foreign aid and other development finance tools that might assist this process of nearshoring to the Western Hemisphere. Omar, would you like to speak
Sure.
to what would be helpful?
Sure. I think that the first thing, the aid, and Fabrizio mentioned it, is education. How can we, with the US, partner with the different regions and different academia to invest in education, both very specific. It cannot be like, we will invest in education. No, it has to be in this, this and that. For instance, on the example Nasak and Fabrizio were doing, like, are we gonna invest in education to build batteries and what is required to do that? So it has to be very targeted, because in the past we've done investments in education, but it's very broad, and then we don't get what we actually need. Second, and you mentioned a little bit about that, is the assessment. There is still a lot to be done, like the raw material assessment that was being shared right now. We need to understand the true capabilities that we can have in the region to see what can we do. So I think that will be a good investment of money. Third one is evaluate incentive, and a second Fabrizio mentioned it. What incentives can we provide to those companies, and understanding, very important to understand the 15% global tax that Fabrizio mentioned as well. So that's something we need to do. And finally, infrastructure. How can, with that aid, in those countries that we define to work in specific products, can foment that investment to go to infrastructure building like airports, ports, etc. So that's where we believe that investment should be used.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to speak to that?
I mean, I just want to say another thing about infrastructure. It's really important that we realize that where we're not investing, China is. And we know that China is using port investments strategically. We know how it's using Belt and Road. So I would plead to the US government that we don't have the luxury of time. I would plead to the Senate or Congress that we don't have the luxury of time. We really need to sort of figure this out. We really need to get our act together because truly time is running out. Thank you.
And if I may just add, a 10% reduction in the cost of international flights, a 10% reduction would increase export value in our region by 30% and export diversification by 25%. Each dollar spent on investment promotion in Latin America and the Caribbean is generating $40 to $50 of additional investment. Each dollar invested in export promotion is generated 50 to 60. So those are the things we have to do. That's where the return on investment is in terms of the development finance in this case.
I just wanted to build, if I may, on something that Fabricio had said, and that is from the perspective of a Latin American. I think for Latin America and the Caribbean, the issue is really attracting foreign investment, making sure that trade and investment deliver on their promises, that they can help boost the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So that is the key. And sometimes from the US perspective, my sense is that geopolitical considerations may be front and center to the policy decisions related to nearshoring and onshoring, etc. So that is one angle to the discussion. But from the perspective of the region, my sense is that that is not really what the main focus of concern. Well, if geopolitical considerations provide an opportunity for the region to attract more investments and to position itself better in these changes that are happening in supply chain, well, that's good. What are the policies that need to be put in place to ensure that that happens and that countries in the region can benefit from that? But I think there's a difference in perspective about the drivers and the underlying interests related to this discussion about nearshoring.
Well, and I think that we've all been talking about nearshoring. I mean, there's so many elements to it that we're not going to have time to talk about all of them. But of course, it's the supply chain vulnerabilities. It's building the economies of our allies. It's helping with sort of keeping their countries stable, keeping the population stable. And then finally, I really wanted to underscore something I mentioned earlier, which was the America Cresay initiative. It's new, it's been launched, but we're working with our Caribbean and Latin American partners to help them reform their legal structure so that we can attract more US investments there. And I really encourage everybody to look at it because I think it's a good starting point, emphasizing starting point, but it's something that we need to really build on for other countries as well.
Are there particular countries in the region that are making some of these positive legal reforms, sort of seizing the opportunity of this capital that's moving and marketing themselves as better environments for investment? Are there policies that we ought to applaud and look for more of in the region?
I would say Costa Rica has a world-class investment promotion agency, which is CINDE. And it's really a one-stop shop with very talented people that know their sectors, that know the companies. And Costa Rica is always at the forefront, really, of looking at opportunities and seizing them. That's why more investment is coming to the country. I just spent 3 days in Paraguay, and I was talking to the Minister of Finance yesterday, the Minister of Trade, and they're really carrying out interesting reforms. They grew in the middle of COVID, where trade decreased, their exports increased 7%, and they don't have a diplomatic relationship with China. They have a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. So it's been their trade is quite diversified, and I think That's also a country that of opportunities. Here in Uruguay, in the services sector, there's a lot of innovation. Colombia, also beyond the troubles, their business climate, if you look at the past 10, 15 years, has been improving increasingly. So I try to look at the glass half full in many ways. I think our region has improved, and but we need to keep working at those structural trade costs, which are still high.
I think from an economic perspective, of course, Mexico is well positioned for all obvious reasons, but I think also Brazil has potential. And when we think about nearshoring, looking at value chain centers in the US, I think Brazil traditionally hasn't been attracting investment to be a platform for exports, right? Companies investing in Brazil look at Brazil as a big consumer market. So I think if Brazil wants to position itself in these nearshoring efforts, it would have to be for companies looking for a dual strategy, right? To cater to the US market, but also to look at Brazil's internal market, which is, of course, is considerable.
Right.
So I wanted to add that from the medical device sector, actually, we are very well positioned in the overall for the Americas. From the top 4 exporter to the US, 3 are on the Americas region. Mexico is one, of course, because being close, but the other 2 are Dominican Republic and Costa Rica, as Fabricio mentioned. So there are many things that we can leverage from what we already know and what we've been doing as well in some of these countries that have great results, such as Costa Rica and Dominican Republic. So if we expand that, if we work on growing what we know already, that's going to be a big benefit as well. Like Costa Rica, the DR grow, the free zone sector grow during the pandemic because of the diversification that we have as well. So there are opportunities that we can leverage. We don't have to start from zero, for sure.
Excellent. All right. This was, I want to thank our panelists, Omar and Isaac, Fabrizio and Tatiana. This was a rich discussion and illustrative of how complex these policies and decisions are. But I think you kicked off the Global Development Forum in an excellent way, and I just appreciate the thoughtfulness of your preparation and your comments here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meredith.
I'm Dan Rundy. Thanks for joining this panel on innovation, resilience, and private investment, achieving the energy transition. This discussion will explore how the US and the broader global community can support the transition to renewable energy through investment to meet global climate challenges. Analysis has shown that to meet the goal of net zero emissions by 2050, emerging economies must increase spending on clean energy by 7 times. The renewable energy transition also requires increased development finance, public participation, and supportive policy measures, lots and lots of mineral development, and infrastructure investment. There's a critical role for the US and other advanced economies play in each of these areas. And today we'll hear from experts on new approaches and new tools that key actors can use to support this transition for a more sustainable global economy. We're joined by 4 distinguished panelists. Mark Corrado, who's the coordinator of the US government's Power Africa program. We have my friend Frank Fannin, a senior advisor at CSIS and a former assistant secretary of state for energy issues. We have Ms. Olu Verheyen, who is the founder and managing director at Latimer Energy. We have Mr. Bruce Niemeyer, vice president for strategy and sustainability for the Chevron Corporation. Thank you everyone for being here. Let me start first with a kickoff question for all of you. Like, how will the US and the broader global community enable and empower the energy transition in emerging markets? Let me start with you first, Mark.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the invite. Always a pleasure to be here. Good to see you again. Every so often we get a chance to have these great conversations, and I certainly appreciate it. I'll just start by saying too, it's as you introduce the group, it's just such a privilege for me to lead Power Africa, and I think we're such a unique player in this space. I think it's one of the better interagency efforts the U.S. government's ever done in terms of trying to push together all those unique pieces you talked about. So we address the key development goals, we focus on ending energy poverty, and we're ensuring that increased economic growth through this inclusive access happens, right? So I think to some extent we're excited and well poised to take on this mandate, and certainly a key part of the Biden-Harris administration's plans on how to help with the renewable transition, one we all know is so desperately needed. I would be remiss if I didn't say a little bit on what we've done over the last 7 years real quick. 118.5 million people have power on some level thanks to Power Africa and its partners. And partners is key. It's not us, it's 170, including the private sector, probably more than anybody else. Resources, expertise, innovation, and particularly the US private sector, helping fuel that success. And so through that, we remain with our goals of 30,000 megawatts, 60 million connections. We've got about 134 deals done to date to financial close, over 12,000 megawatts and a value of over $22 billion. So that said, there's a ton of work to go. So getting to your question, just saying the context real quick. Everyone knows the tough statistics, but it's worth just, I think, making sure we really internalize them. 580 million people still don't have power in sub-Saharan Africa. 100,000 health clinics on the heels of a COVID pandemic we're still dealing with don't have the right kind of electrification. More than half of the region's population that is either not having healthcare or power themselves in their house. So on some level, energy fuels everything. And we have to figure out a way to do that sustainably over time. So Power Africa is trying to take this forward in a couple of ways. I say we're in kind of 3 big buckets. We're able to really help in a lot of ways. One is ending energy poverty, I mentioned before. So that is the work we're going to do to power COVID response and recovery, enhancing digital connectivity, and also just the human development and economic growth mandate we've had since the beginning. We're there to combat climate change, as you talked about, decarbonizing the grid, getting into more of that later with some specifics as useful, supporting a just transition to do that though, however, knowing that it doesn't look the same place, the same energy mix everywhere. And then finally looking at, I think, an idea that hopefully you'll be getting a lot at COP26, a fairly big announcement coming down the pike with distributed renewable energy. So what is it? What can we do to leapfrog and change the dynamic altogether? That's one big thing, is that probably we've seen that traditional grid development has never happened fast enough. It's far too expensive, has the wrong kind of capital needed in measure to do it on a pace we need to do to help those 580 million people. And then the last one, of course, is what we're really proud of as well, is bolstering the US private sector innovation on this. We're looking to start a new initiative, an idea of US Africa clean energy hubs. How do we really link the innovation, the expertise, the resources we have back in the States to help foster this innovation, this revolution, as it were. Of course, on the other side, we're always there to try to work on strengthening the regulatory frameworks, the enabling environment, knowing that this stuff doesn't happen very easily in some of these markets. And then finally, putting all that forward to say there's a model out there that works. That private sector is a model we're bringing. And when we look at other competitors and so forth, when we look at the value of the private sector we have behind us, we far eclipse any offering anybody else can bring to the table. Let me stop there for now, but just super excited to say that we got a ton to offer and excited to work with the likes of the panelists.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. Frank, I got mineral religion talking to you. You're a senior advisor at CSIS. Some of the statistics you told me about, if we want to move in the direct, if we're going to have an energy transition, my takeaway is we're going to have to profoundly learn to love mining in a deeper, more profound way than we've ever imagined in human history. So Frank, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dan. I'd like to also reinforce Mark's comments and appreciation to join this distinguished panel. I think we start fundamentally that everything that we have in modern life is either grown or mined, everything. And when we talk about the energy transition, what we're really talking about is transitioning from one type of energy that's mined to another type of energy that's mined. With respect to the inputs. And the energy transitions fundamentally is about electrifying everything, whether it's transport or wind turbines or electricity generation. And that requires minerals to do that. We're changing the composition from a fossil fuels-based economy to something other than and non-emitting. But that requires a different suite of minerals to go into that. And just, if one considers something like the internal combustion engine versus an electric vehicle, an electric vehicle has some 5 to 8 times more copper than an internal combustion engine does. Now, what we're effectively doing is replacing that oil, petrochem that goes into that vehicle for fuel to another kind of chemical reaction, the kind that takes place in a lithium-ion battery, and then all of the copper components that go into that. But the scale of the mineral intensity required to achieve, whether they're just clean energy targets or if they're linked to a climate change target like the Paris Climate Accord, the scale of that transformation is really exponential. We will require, according to the World Bank, I would put on the more conservative statistics modelers, they found that to achieve the Paris climate goals would require a renewable, a clean energy growth, and the minerals that underpin that growth would have to expand something like 1,000%. Just in terms of copper, we'll have to mine as much copper to achieve the Paris Climate Accord. We'll have to mine as much copper that in the next 25 years than humanity has mined in the last 5,000. So let
me just stop you there, Frank, because I want you to come back to this, but I just want to double click on what you just said. So if we want to achieve the climate transition, I don't think most people have heard this, and I heard this first time from you and it blew my mind. If we want to achieve the energy transition as envisioned by 2050, we're going to have to mine as much copper. I'm not talking cobalt or lithium, but meat and potato metals like copper and nickel, as much copper in the next 25 years as we've mined the last 5,000. So that's not a step change in mining, Frank. Is that like 2 or 3 step changes in mining?
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom, given we're also seeing significant grade decline from the existing reserves that we have. And there's an increasing pressure because a lot of the copper in particular tend to be in places that lack water.
Sorry, what's grade decline? Does that mean like less quality when you pull the stuff out of the earth?
Yeah, so the biggest copper mine in the world is La Escondida in Chile. And it has about, for every ton of
stuff you take out,
you get about 0.5% is actual copper. So we have to mine more and more and more to get the same amount. So we have to, it opens up new frontier.
Frank, I don't know a lot of people in the climate, folks who've been pushing and advocating for climate change, who love mining that much. How is that? I had a conversation with a very senior leader in the Democratic Party, and I told him this, and he said to me, and this is the rational response, which is climate change is such a pressing emergency that we have to make trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs is going to be that we're going to have to do a lot more mining. Is that what you're basically saying, Frank?
Without question. And we're going to have to do it when some of that, but it also opens up a values question. And Mark spoke to the concept of a just transition. And I think it's important to keep that in mind to ensure that that some of the mining districts, that the standards for that mining is done in a way that aligns with our values, so that they're done that actually empower local communities, that are done in a way that respect human rights, that, you know, and right now, most of the mining for these energy transition metals is dominated by China, where we don't have the degree of transparency that we have here. So I think we have to have a complete, I mean, Mark used the term leapfrogging. We're gonna have to think about this in a new way to achieve any of this that doesn't create a perverse outcome.
So Frank, you alluded to this earlier, but somebody said to me recently, told me how many pounds of copper are in a Tesla battery, and you referred to this, and they use kilos, so I'm going to use it for the American audience. There's 200 pounds of copper in a regular Tesla battery, not the super duper Tesla battery, but just like the plain vanilla Tesla battery. That's a lot of copper. Am I right, Frank?
So it's a tremendous amount. It's tremendous.
Right. So we're going to have, I think my view is if the AID and the multilateral development banks are going to have special mining and development units. And they haven't thought about this. Much of the global development community is conflicted about mining. There are folks in the community development space and civil society don't like mining, and that there's some reasons for that. And it strikes me, if we want to do this, we're going to have a big bear hug with Canada and Australia, who know how to do mining better than we do. And I'm guessing we're not going to have a lot of mining in Montgomery County and Fairfax County. Is that a fair statement, Frank?
I think it is fair. There also is different ways that we can extract some of these metals.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, we have to square our outcome with the steps required to get there. We can't just pretend like it's not happening, because it is.
Yeah, but so Frank, I thought that windmills and solar panels just should have magically appeared when I order them on Amazon. That's not how it works. What are you trying to say?
Someone is producing all that stuff somewhere in different parts of the world.
And so when I order my Tesla vehicle, when the battery just shows up, it just kind of shows up, right? I mean, I don't want to be bothered with all these details, right?
No, we have to be mindful of the details, or we're going to create significant problems for ourselves. And I also say it's a geopolitical risk, given the market concentration. I mean, we talk a lot about the market concentration of oil, right? And choke points in the Straits of Hormuz and all of this. And the President Biden administration has called on OPEC to increase production to help moderate oil prices. But never has OPEC in its heyday had the degree of market concentration that China has when it comes to these critical materials for the energy transition.
Yeah. Well, look, Frank, this is helpful. So I want folks to come away from my exchange with Frank on the following thing, that if we want to achieve the energy transition, we're going to have not one step change bigger in mining, but 2 steps bigger in mining. And we're going to have to find new technologies to kind of adapt. So it's possible that battery technologies will improve and we'll use less metals, but we're still going to use a lot of metals. And we may be able to use new kinds of technologies for mineral extraction and new kinds of technologies for mineral recycling. But that they aren't currently on the table right now. And so we're going to have to make some trade-offs to achieve the energy transition. And this is one of the hard and real trade-offs. And there's a big role for global development in making that happen. Isn't that right, Frank?
No question. It's critically important. And I was pleased to see that the Biden administration is continuing one of the programs to help create that standard setting, to help work with countries to improve their own mining codes and do it and produce resources in a responsible way. They called the Energy Resource Governance Initiative.
So I think the Biden administration is well equipped to kind of manage these issues. They're thinking about these issues. It's on their agenda at the State Department, at AID. So I'm confident we'll get there, but there's gonna be some work involved, right?
Without question, tremendous.
Okay, good. Thanks, Frank. Olu, thanks for being here. I'm so appreciative that you agreed to be a part of this panel. Could you, so talk a little bit about how the US and the broader global community will empower the energy transition in emerging markets, Olu?
Thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to join this distinguished panel. I'm just going to build a little bit on the points that Mark and Frank have already raised. And that is but before I do that, I just wanted to differentiate between the developing markets and emerging markets, where, the bulk where, some of sub-Saharan African countries that I focus mostly on in my career fall into the developing market basket. And when we're talking about the energy transition, it matters, that differentiation matters because it informs the kind of solutions and to the specific problems that you have. And so when you talk about emerging markets like India and Russia, who have relatively more advanced high carbon development models, they account for the bulk of the emission growth that you see in some of the IEA reports that have been circulated. Then it's different from the challenges that we face in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's minimal contribution to emissions because of high poverty and energy poverty. And, for example, the beautiful state of Maryland consumes, electricity consumption in Maryland is about 20 times that of Kenya's. Kenya has a population of 50. Maryland has a population of 6 million. So the problems are slightly different because we're in different stages of development. So, and if you look into the projection going forward, the energy consumption is going to remain very low. I think BP did BP estimated about 10% of total energy demand all the way into 2050, and we account for 25% of the population. So this problem persists regardless of the transition. So the challenge that we face here really is how to grow that energy demand in a sustainable manner to unlock development and climate adaptation for an increasingly urban population. So that, and when we start thinking about solutions within the sub-Saharan African context, there are a few guiding principles that are typically helpful. One is the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. There's no 10th commandment for energy transition. So what you do in South Africa, where it's a coal-dominated energy system, is going to be very different from what you do in Mozambique, which is mostly biofuels, even though it's going to be one of the biggest exporters of natural gas. The second thing is affordability. It's really key here because end users are incredibly price sensitive due to low incomes. So least cost sustainable solutions are key. And the third one, just to, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, Mark's point, is urbanization and industrialization. So we need to come up with solutions around electrification that address those needs. And a lot of the solutions out in the market tend to be things that address, off-grid solutions or things that are micro solutions that address things that better meet needs in rural or peri-urban areas. So in terms of what the US can do, I think the key thing in this environment is really around blended finance, because the cost of these investments are incredibly high. So blended finance is critical, and some of the work that Mark and his colleagues are doing and some of the other DFIs are doing are really important to unlock private sector investment. When you think about that in markets like Nigeria and Kenya, the focus when you're talking about electrification really should be around transmission and distribution capacity. And because those will be a lot more impactful than additional investments in generation capacity, because a lot of the generation capacity is already stranded. Second one is just growth rates for emissions. Is around leadership. And the leadership we're talking about is some of the points that Mark has already talked about. But it's just really talking about the fact that when we talk about emissions, we talk about the growth rate of emissions, but in absolute terms, the advanced economies still dominate on a per capita basis. So, what's needed there is leadership around, investments in clean tech, in, how we think about mining, how we think about innovation for all kinds of, clean and renewable energy efficiency, particularly in this sector. And, those things are beneficial in two ways. One, that's the most high impact pathway to decarbonization, because we're talking about reducing concentration currently, not in the future. The second one is it enables affordability, and it potentially limits the growth of fossil fuels in African energy systems. And then when the other thing that comes up a lot is around how do we leapfrog and how can you assist these economies and their energy systems? Can we leapfrog them? I think it's really important to take the GSM example that's usually very well cited and point out some really important things, because it may be very useful as we think about how the US and other advanced economies can help. So GSM was already affordable and widely available in the US. Most 70% of adults had one. I got one right out of college. And so before that technology was adopted in Africa and rolled out by private players, not because they were told to do so, but because it made economic sense to do so. And there was enabling policy that made those investments attractive. So the same thing will need to happen. That's sort of the path for the energy transition when we're talking about it here. It's not going to be leapfrogging to renewables. There are intermediate steps that we need to think about. Gas is a key one. And it's not really about dictating policy. It is really figuring out in every market what is applicable, what is a sensible transition, especially in places where there's high energy poverty and where there's low emissions, and how to move that forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Olu. There was a very interesting article by the Vice President of Nigeria in Foreign Affairs. I'm sure you saw it. About, I'd be interested in your comments about, so it strikes me, I think of the 54 sub-Saharan African countries, I believe 50 of them have oil, gas reserves, and many of them may have coal. I believe, Olu, that those 50 of the 54 sub-Saharan African countries are going to develop those resources one way or the other. So I'd welcome your either comment on commenting on this Foreign Affairs article by the Vice President of Nigeria, or on my statement that of the 50 of the 54 sub-Saharan African countries, one way or the other, they're going to develop those resources. They're not going to leave them in the ground. And then on GSM, just to clarify, I think we may be showing our age if we say what GSM was. I think GSM was, a cell phone technology from the 90s, right?
Correct, cell phones.
Right, so like there was this thing called cassette tapes and 8-track tapes, and there was this thing called GSM. I know, I suspect you still use GSM, but anyway, but Olu, just on my two questions, 50 out of 54 sub-Saharan African countries, are they going to develop their oil, gas, and probably coal resources and not leave them on the ground? I'm guessing they will. Second, I'd be interested in just you commenting on that Foreign Affairs article if you felt that if you were open to doing that.
To doing that, yes, no problem at all. I think there, in terms of will they develop it, I think there is sufficient resources already developed, right? First, there is very little use of coal outside of South Africa on the continent, in sub-Saharan Africa, very little coal used. So, and that is likely to remain the case if we can figure out solutions to penetrating domestic markets, i.e., what are the ways to make sure that you improve credit worthiness of gas off-takers, build the infrastructure, and trade more gas within Africa? You're likely to significantly reduce the chances of coal growing in that energy mix. And you may also limit the need to further exploration, but I know Bruce will probably speak to a lot of that later on with Chevron's experience in the market. But so will a lot of these companies will a lot of these countries develop those resources? It depends a little bit on their ability. One, if some of these reserves are commercial, not all of them are, and if they can attract private capital, because that's a key part of developing some of these resources. Most of those resources are usually exported. And so if a lot of financing is being constrained to fossil fuels, that impacts the ability and the attractiveness of some of these resources. So I think it's a safer bet to say that places, big gas places, big North Africa, where there's been a lot of discovery, will continue to do that, and you have near field explorations versus brand new explorations like what you had in Senegal or what you had in Mozambique going forward, because those will be just difficult to fund. And the people who typically fund them are from employers like Shell or Chevron. And so if they're pushing to, if they're moving towards more renewables, and there's limited, and that depends on, and there's limited market because of the availability, because of the accelerated transition in developed economies, then that may limit it may not be economically attractive to do further exploration, brand new greenfield exploration. In terms of the Vice President's article in Foreign Affairs, and I think it's the same one, I saw it in another piece. I didn't look at it in Foreign Affairs. And I think his point is just that a country like Nigeria that has 80% of its gas, that has 80% of its central grid powered by gas, and is incorporating hydro, looking at ways to incorporate electricity to increase electrification rates, should be allowed to do so and should not be penalized because we're going through an early transition, an energy transition that most countries in Africa cannot really afford, and actually sometimes doesn't meet their needs. So let's talk about that, the particular country that he's referring to, that's Nigeria. Over 50% of Nigerians live near the grid already. 75% of them in 2050 will live near the grid. And so if you have a gas grid in place, it makes sense for the government of Nigeria to do what it can to attract investments into extension and densification of that gas grid to serve the bulk of its population, than looking at renewables that are not yet mature or probably not affordable yet. And that's essentially the summary of that. It doesn't mean that he's not looking at distributed energy resources that are suitable for for urban areas or low consumption areas. But when you're talking about high density demand in high density areas, a grid makes sense, and Nigeria should be allowed to extend its natural gas grid.
Thank you. Let me just remind folks that there are 1 billion citizens that live in Africa, and by 2050, there will be 2 billion citizens that live in Africa. Africa is rapidly urbanizing, and most people by 2050, a majority of people in Africa will live in cities by 2050 in Africa. There's an emerged middle class now, and it's going to grow a lot over the next 25 years in Africa. This is great news. This is great for the world. There will be more citizens living in Africa 25 years from today than all the citizens living in India and China combined under some demographic projections. I believe them. So how we're going to power that future is really important. And Africa's going to need an entire mix, especially if it's urbanizing and changing its economic development model, including manufacturing and other forms of economic activity, right, Olu? I mean, it's just we're just going to need a lot of different forms of energy to power that future.
Absolutely, and especially when we're talking about industrialization, there are quite a few hard to abate elements in industrialization. So a country that's aspiring to industrialization can't really deploy clean energy to everything yet. And you can't really expect Nigeria with 200 million people, high poverty rates, growing insecurity, to not address those immediate development needs until maybe battery costs fall or hydrogen becomes economically viable. It needs to use that gas now. And as those advances and investments are happening and accelerating in advanced economies, then it can potentially limit the growth of gas in its electricity mix or its energy mix. But it can't wait till then.
Thank you, Olu. Bruce, thanks so much for being here. I'm so glad you were able to join us. Could you talk about how you see the US and the broader global community empowering the energy transition in emerging markets?
Yeah, Dan, and let me say first, thank you for the invitation, and really pleased to join this panel today. The conversation already has been quite interesting. I think maybe taking a step back, and it really picks up on some of the points you were making and Olu was making. The world population is growing, expected to grow by 2 billion inhabitants by 2050. Incomes are growing as well, and the most of that growth is going to be in the developing world, and those are strong tailwinds to energy demand. We have seen energy demand grow and need really growth in all forms of energy. But as has been discussed, from a number of the panelists, every part of the globe isn't starting in the same location or the same setting today. And what we have observed in the differences that exist, commonality that seems to persist across all areas of the planet, is a desire for affordable, reliable, and now ever cleaner energy to meet the needs of society wherever it is today and whatever trajectory it's trending along, because energy enables human progress and enables so many things in life, and is so central to what those that have it enjoy on a daily basis, and those that yearn to have it seek to incorporate to better their lives. I think it's important to recognize that not only with the energy transition is there an aspect of electrification, and there's a lot of discussion and focus on renewable power, and we think renewable power is going to grow very rapidly. But in order to be fully successful in the energy transition, you must also deal with the hard to abate sectors, marine, aviation, heavy duty transport, industrial uses. And in many of those cases, electrification is not the obvious or maybe even practical choice in addressing those things. And so I think it's important that leadership and thought around the energy transition is inclusive of all forms of energy that are consumed and how we address those. In Chevron, we're focused really in two broad areas. The first is reducing the carbon intensity of our existing oil and gas businesses. And we've talked already on the panel about the role of the traditional energy system. And in a successful energy transition, we have to find ways for that to become increasingly carbon efficient while we continue to rely on the great advantages that it has in terms of energy density, its affordability, its reliability. And then simultaneously being engaged in activities that are hard to abate. And for us, that's progressing carbon capture, progressing hydrogen, progressing renewable liquids fuels and gaseous fuels that can have an overall lower carbon intensity. And as a company across those activities, we're focused on spending $10 billion by 2028. But it's a big transition that faces us as a society, and it's going to require leadership and partnership across governments, players like Chevron, all sectors of the economy in order to be successful.
Thanks, Bruce. That's great. I've got a series of questions for each of the panels, but maybe I want to just give a chance for all the panels just to react what other folks have said. Frank, why don't I turn to you and just give you a chance to react to what you've heard, and then Mark, and then Olu, and then Bruce.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the themes, the commonalities here, and I think you can't reinforce it enough, is that the energy transition, we're not starting all at the same place. And there has to be a mindfulness of that. And also, that frankly, gas can undergird some of the development of renewables at scale. I mean, it's a foundational kind of element from which you can then have the significant growth of renewables over time. But I think we have to be mindful of the variance in starting positions and the relative optionality that geography and just weather can have for as well as resource endowments for different countries, and how can we help countries achieve their own clean energy ambition, because I believe all populations want to have cleaner forms of energy.
Good. Mark?
Yeah, no, a great conversation. I mean, I don't disagree with anything anyone said in terms of we got to look at this in a very holistic way. And I think, we're well poised to see that. I mean, when we have a development agenda on one side and a climate, we don't see those as mutually exclusive. We see those as mutually reinforcing. I think, Olu's points, Nigeria is different from South Africa, is different from Malawi, is different from Kenya, no doubt, right? So I think we have to look and see what's possible. That said, I think we do have to push ourselves as hard as possible down a renewable path. We all know it has to be at a clip that's been faster than we've done in the past. We all know that, I always say that we follow the market. Well, to some extent, we accelerate the market. We're making sure we're looking at market trends. We see the price of solar coming way down. It's cost comparable to just about everything else it's going up against. Of course, there's base load issues. Of course, there's energy mix issues. I get all that. We're gonna have to look at that very specifically. However, the market's going there. Every dollar I spend is a subsidy, right? Every dollar I spend is one of your tax dollars, one of my tax dollars, one of my grandma's tax dollars. We gotta make sure that when we mix it with private capital, we're being smart to hit the trajectory and subsidizing in a smart way. Blended finance, absolutely. It is the key to the future. And I think, Dan, you know me well enough to know that I've been a stalwart of the private sector first focus for aid long before it was probably the biggest thing in vogue. However, how we make that capital stack is going to matter, right? We got to make sure we're not crowding out the wrong kind of capital in the wrong spaces, and that we are using, whether it be philanthropic capital or government capital or countries' capital themselves, to make sure we incentivize the right part of the market with the right enabling environment there to meet it, right? So to some extent, I would say, what would the pitch we always make? Africa's a good investment. The market doesn't see it that way enough yet. People still at some points need a different kind of return. Sometimes that concessional capital is pushing out private capital where it shouldn't be because people don't understand the market risk. Part of what we're trying to do is mitigate that market risk by saying, if we work with the Kenyans and they have the right legal framework, then they're ready to negotiate with you. By working with the Malawi and saying, here's a transparent procurement framework that now allows you to go in there as a company and bid appropriately, make use of the investment you have to make to be competitive, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to make sure that when we do that we put the capital in that right spot, right? And then we move it. And all of us, I think, and I appreciate everyone's comments, can move, notwithstanding the problems of mining, notwithstanding the problems of just transition, talk about coal transition in South Africa. I was just on a trip down there talking about looking at those issues very carefully. What's that going to take? Notwithstanding all the absolutely challenging situations we have coming forward, if we keep pushing to show the private sector that the market risk is not what they think it is, that the returns are still great, that the model can work, that if we all put our capital in the right spots, we'll push us forward a lot faster. And there's a lot of technologies now, and as prices fall and battery efficiency improves and prices fall and all this stuff, I think we'll be seeing a lot more opportunities than we currently see today. And I think that will push the energy mix toward a renewable position as fast as it possibly can go.
Olu?
No, I agree with a lot of what's been said around, just the need to, that, no matter what the challenges are, that we need to keep an eye on that long-term goal of moving to a cleaner future and to, a more renewable path where possible. And I think the main thing there is just really about, where those investments need to take place in innovation, and where is their capacity and where is it going to have the highest impact on climate change? Is it where there is little emissions happening, or is it in areas where there is high emissions happening? And that's the first piece. And then the second piece is just that, especially in places like Nigeria, what can we do to build on some of the points that Bruce has mentioned? What can we do to lower the carbon intensity in some of these oil producing countries? Innovation around, taking out flares, for example, reducing methane within, production. All of those types of things are required. Can we accelerate additional investments in distributed gas technologies that can help with capturing these things? So all of those types. So essentially, we're all saying the same thing, which is just let's think broadly and invite any folks to the table. Let's not let perfection be the enemy of good, because there's some solutions that work in the interim, and so that we can actually we can reach that more perfect state that we're trying to achieve.
Great. Okay, Bruce.
Well, I think the one thing that strikes me just listening to all the panelists is the complexity of the challenge in front of us. It's hard for any of us individually to appreciate the scale of the energy system, because we only personally touch a small part of it every day. But it is a massive system that is actually trying to grow to support growing global needs. And I think the other thing that I take away is the importance of partnership across a variety of different perspectives and organizations in order to make this occur. The additional comment that I would have is that we've found that we're best served when we establish performance standards or goals and are less prescriptive about how it's accomplished. We've had a venture investing organization for more than 2 decades now. We're invested in batteries, in electric vehicle charging, in autonomous vehicles, in nuclear, in advanced geothermal and offshore wind. And it's hard to predict at the outset what is going to really emerge and become scalable and investable in the long term. But setting a standard for progress unlocks innovation and allows the capabilities of a variety of different types of organizations to come together. And we think progress is possible. We've had great progress working with the Angolan government in reducing flaring, for example. And there is a lot of interest and desire, and with the right kind of aspirations established and unlocking innovation, I think we can make a lot of progress and maybe work beyond some of the challenges that we've identified in the conversation today.
Great. Olu, could you talk about we've talked to some of this already, but I'd welcome your additional thoughts about opportunities and challenges for the African continent for the energy transition? Because it seems to me, when I think about Africa, it's a continent with renewable energy, sun and wind, hydro, got enormous potential for oil and gas. So I welcome sort of how you think about this, Olu.
Thanks. Yeah, there are a few challenges, and to Mark's point that most people are aware of the challenges, but we don't spend a lot of time on the opportunities. So I'll just spend a quick, just very high level points on the challenges. The scale of investments required, right? So the IEA report says it's $150 billion that we're spending, and it's not enough. We need to grow that by a factor of 7. That's $1 trillion. Where does that come from? In a lot of these markets that are still developing, very early stages of readiness for a lot of the technology that we're talking about, which is actually really difficult to attract capital to, even in developed economies, not to talk of developing economies. So that's one challenge, the scale of the investments that are required. There's very limited fiscal space for public investments in a lot of these countries. Mainly because one, they're not, they don't have diversified exports. They're not rich countries. We said that already. They're low-income countries. But also the little bit that they have is spent on poorly targeted, regressive subsidies like electricity subsidies and fuel subsidies that distort the market and are not really helpful in trying to move us forward. Redirecting some of that capital, for example, into public investments instead of just recurrent public expenditure that it's not really subsidizing the people that it's intended to subsidize is one thing to resolve. The other big challenge is insolvent utilities. So the prices are typically set that are at rates that are way too low for cost recovery to be able to make investments or to get a reasonable return on your investment. And so those are a key challenge that's a key barrier and a key challenge. And we're starting to see some movement in different countries around that to resolve that challenge and make grid electricity especially much more, be less regulated and much more market determined. The other bit of it is macroeconomic instability, and that goes to the points that have been discussed around just an investment-friendly regulatory framework. That impacts the bankability of a lot of projects and the feasibility. A lot of projects don't make it to FID because of that. And so you're talking about volatile exchange rates. We're talking about high inflation, very limited local currency, long-term capital funding to match the receivables. All of these things impact the ability to attract investments to that project. The last one is just risk associated with the policy. It's the main reason for the cost of capital, right? So if you think an investment is risky, you price your return accordingly, and that's why the cost of capital in Nigeria is 7 times the U.S., for example. So we can't completely financial engineer our way out of that with blended finance capital. Some of these regulatory reforms need to happen to lower that cost and risk.
Thank you, Olu. So Frank, we talked a little bit about minerals. What's the path forward with how we're gonna, if we all agree that there's gonna be a step change in mining, where and how are we gonna achieve sort of the ability to mine all of the minerals that we're gonna need for the energy transition?
Yeah, well, I think I would reframe the question a little bit, Dan, and put it in the context of what is our driver here to just mine this stuff as cheaply, as rapidly as possible, or are we intending to develop the resource in a way that advances the communities and the countries where the resources are located? And those are two different questions. And that's why and that's why in Africa is a lot of resource endowment to contribute to the energy transition in multiple ways. And so I think, I'm kind of on the view that we should, the entire marketplace, these are relative to oil and gas, which is, oil is about the most fungible, transparent commodity that's traded, where price discovery is very clear, and it's a true global market. That's not the case with some of these, which had been up until very, very recently niche metals. things like lithium, they're not openly traded. And there's so price discovery, transparency, these are new concepts. And I think we have to, the whole idea of leapfrogging technology, we should leapfrog the kind of create a new market mechanism for some of these metals so that they can have proper transparency and have values associated with it to ensure we're incenting responsible production. If we do that, then we level the playing field that hopefully the development community, civil society, the public at large will embrace resource development, including in places like the United States, and enable that, and also level the playing field to incent countries to do things responsibly and empower countries in the developing world, in particular in Africa, and give them the tools to develop appropriately so that they can attract the best kind of investors in the world. Because as I think we also have a common theme here, private capital is the thing that's going to move these markets. Private capital is going to be the game changer here. And so we need to make sure that private capital is deployed appropriately and it's aligned with our values.
Great, thanks. Mark, how does Power Africa's goals, which are really important, how are you thinking about them in the context of the Biden-Harris administration goals on climate?
No, thanks. As I said, I think we are a big part of the plan in a big important part of the world. The flip side of what everyone's saying is that not a big emissions target yet, but the IEA says unless you get the path right now, and to your point, Dan, of growing populations, this could be a tremendous problem we don't even know we have yet. And we already have a tremendous problem, right? So we are all in on trying to figure out how, as I said before, how to push this market quicker as possible. Notwithstanding any of the complications you mentioned earlier and that people have talked about, and I think those are all absolutely need to be figured out. And we're there right with you on, we're working on methane abatement as well. We're working on all these areas. But I think a couple of ways that Power Africa is going to do this. One of which is we're going to keep pushing renewable energy solutions as much as possible. Now, of course, not in spots where you don't think it's viable. And I think Olu made a really great point there. There's some countries where right now the energy mix is overextended. We don't need to add stuff there, but there's other spots where we really could, and we need to make sure we focus on those. So by getting just 17,500 more megawatts by 2030, and hopefully most of those are clean, we're pushing those future emissions down. We're tracking how we look at CO2 based on what's called a clear methodology to see what the standard mix would be had we had not been in there trying to put the counter negative. We're trying to figure out with a whole bunch of other folks, SE for All for One, how do we look at the off-grid play we've had for so long? How do we make that off-grid play more industrial? How do we look at making sure the productive use of energy, as Olu mentioned, can also work in the rural areas if we're going to go with some sort of more rural distributed energy solution, right? So there's a couple things there. Make the grid faster, make it more efficient, make it more cost effective. I absolutely agree with the utility point. Holy cow. Every time you go in there and you look at a utility who loses money every time they put a customer on, you're like, this is a thorny problem set, but we got to work it out. It kind of blows your mind. So a little bit of definitely improvement there. We have to look at the grid itself. The grid efficiency is huge. We liken about a 1% decrease in transmission losses across Africa is about the same as a 1,500 megawatt coal plant, right? So just the stuff we're doing there, even the stuff we're getting on, we're losing so much energy efficiency and how we move it around. So that's another big thing we're looking at. We also think that, as I mentioned before, and this is a point I want to just double down on a little bit, is notwithstanding trying to get the grid better, notwithstanding the traditional off-grid solutions we're looking at, mostly at a home level, right? We've all seen the price of what you can do at a house, the level of power you can give to that household, even at a community level for small, medium enterprise is increasing, and that will continue to improve. In addition to that grid getting better, more efficient, that off-grid play at a more community solar level getting done, this idea of distributed renewable grids, I think, is key. As I just mentioned, when you put a plant over here and you got to pipe it through 1,000 kilometers of transmission line over there, you got to have the wherewithal to manage the thing, look at the load shedding, look at all the potential possibilities. It's hard. Some of these solutions could be in some areas, especially where they're nascent, is what we call both mini grids, but also macro mini grids is an oxymoron, I know, but this idea that you could put 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 people on a standalone grid, maybe with a new utility structure. We're looking at this already in Nigeria and a few other spots. Other folks like GridWorks are looking at this as well. How do we change the way the utilities see themselves, right? How could they grow on? And then how do we meet that intersection at time? We can design smartly. So when that mini grid does hit a grid, or that macro grid hits a grid, or that metro grid, as some people are calling it, hits a grid, or those off-grid households, that when you do have the culmination, they work smartly, and then you don't waste all the energy and efficiency and investment you've done to build up 3 different systems, albeit related systems over time. But there has to be a step change. Clearly the pace we're doing it now with 580 million people still without power, and then if I threw an unsustainable, unreliable power or super expensive power in there, mind-boggling. So clearly we got to get better at what we're doing.
So Bruce, help us out. This will be the last question. Just given the challenges, some countries are developed, some countries in the process of developing, some are not fully developed, some countries don't have enough electricity or power already. It's clear that we're going to need some kind of mix of renewables and non-renewables to get to this energy transition. How does Chevron see this?
Well, overall, we see the future of energy as lower carbon. We think that's the clear direction of travel. Climate change is real. We support the Paris Agreement, and we have to come together in ways that we are working towards as a society. But obviously, there's more progress that needs to occur. Probably the direct answer to your question varies a bit depending on where you are in the world, because again, starting points matter, and you have to do something that meets the full needs of society, and that includes economic growth and development and enablement, access to power. The power has to be affordable, it has to be reliable, and so that will likely suggest differing answers depending on where you are in the world. But we have to make progress, and policy, we've touched on it a little bit. Policy and regulatory frameworks are very important. We've supported a price on carbon, and we recognize there are challenges associated with that, but a price on carbon, if we can find ways to get it enacted at the highest possible level, we can work with natural market drivers, we can unlock innovation, and the market and innovation can help find the best solutions. Where renewables are the best solution, that's where they should go. Where there is a decarbonized form of hydrogen, that's where it should go. But those structures are ultimately very important, and that's a piece combined with private action and the action of participants in every sector, ultimately necessary to solve that lower carbon future energy system, which we believe will occur.
I think we should end it here. This has been just so great. I appreciate all of you being on the panel today. Thanks for joining us. Please stay on. We're going to be hosting the president of the Dominican Republic at 12 noon. So I want to thank this panel, and thanks everybody, and we'll be in touch. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be hosting the President of the Dominican Republic, President Luis Abinader, for a keynote conversation. The United States has a key partner in the Dominican Republic. We have a long history. There are over 2 million members of the Dominican diaspora, the 5th largest Hispanic population in the United States, with a significant cultural presence throughout the arts, music, sports, and politics here in the US. The Dominican Republic is the United States' 4th largest trading partner in Latin America and the Caribbean, and is the 6th most popular destination in the world for US tourists. We are really fortunate in the US to have a key partner like President Abinader. We have a window of opportunity for the Biden-Harris administration to re-engage with the Dominican Republic along a number of shared priorities. And so I'm so pleased to have President Abinader with us. He's an economist, he's a business person and a politician. He was the 54th president of the Dominican Republic. He has studied in the United States in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He has taken courses at Harvard University. He's taken courses at Dartmouth College. And he's done a number of notable achievements in his first year in office, promoting an independent judicial system, making sure there's been an efficient vaccination program, prioritizing health and responding to the COVID challenge. And he's also supported actions that guarantee gender equality and the development of women in the Dominican Republic. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to the President Abinader for some opening remarks. Mr. President.
Yes, thank you very much to Mr. Dan Runde, Senior Vice President and Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development of the Americas Program at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. I am very pleased to take part in this year's Global Development Forum, and I would like to thank all participants from the United States and from other parts of the world who could join us today to discuss some of the urgent challenges we face globally and in particular in our hemisphere. This meeting can be an ideal place to reflect all the drastic changes that have occurred in the world in recent years and how the global pandemic has modified many of the ideas and plans that we had for the near future. Before the pandemic, and as you all know, the main challenge in most of the emerging world were the climate change, adaptability to the challenge of the 4th industrial revolution, emerging technologies such as 5G, and the automation of production and jobs. The combined effects of the pandemic, the economic crisis, political tensions, and violence in various parts of the world and in our region have generated a lag in all these matters. In particular, the pandemic has left countries in debt, ailing economies, and millions of people worse off than before. Our social protection system were not prepared to withstand the onslaught, and the climate crisis has continued to advance. All these challenges that were urgent before, today cannot be postponed any longer. And the key to overcome them is in combining the correct responses and the loyal collaboration of the nations. And in this role, the USA, who is the largest economy on the planet, plays a very important role, seeing it has the mechanism and the necessary strength to articulate policies that affect recovery and support the countries of the region in their exit from the crisis. The European Union has generated, for example, new mechanism for collaboration among its members, which is allowing it to have a powerful umbrella under where their members can avoid the worst consequences of this global pandemic. For this reason, on this continent, we need the collaborative and audacious look. We share a geographical area, yes, but also values, and that is where our strength lies. And this is the line the Dominican government is following: bold answers, collaboration, and implementation of new agreements. We believe that it is the time to reinvestment to be redirected with a sense of social responsibility and for the benefit of the progress of all people. So, Attracting greater flows of foreign direct investment is vital in the current and post-pandemic stages, characterized by readjustment of shorter and less fragmented global value chains, in which value added tends to be more concentrated regionally. This mechanism, known as nearshoring, can also be converted into an opportunity for those countries that can articulate an effective promotion plan, taking advantage of their industrial ecosystems, their geographical location close to the main markets, and trade and investment agreement with strategic partners. In the case of the Americas, it is important to promote the approach of productions to large consumption centers because it allows us to generate a shield of social progress to protect democracies, moderate migration, and relaunch regional integration processes. To promote growth based on internal and regional demand, as the trend seems to point at presently, it is necessary also to direct the volume of private and institutional capital towards sectors such as health, infrastructure, specific innovation, renewable energies, water and sanitation, and food and agriculture. If the pandemic, if we learn something from the pandemic, it is that we must be creative to build resilient and adaptable societies. Taking back the world from before COVID-19 may no longer be feasible, but that doesn't mean that we can build a different, but also a better one. The Dominican Republic is working with anticipation and serving as an example to many neighboring countries. We can do things differently and conquer the future with determination if we are united in the same purpose and we all pitch in for the benefit of our region and our people. We cannot fail. Thank you very much to all, and I am at your disposal so that you can ask me what you consider could be interesting for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Could you, Mr. President, talk about how you would like to see U.S. and Dominican Republic political and economic engagement going forward? We enjoy the CAFTA-DR trade agreement, so we have a trade relationship with you. You're an important trading partner for the United States. Sometimes we overlook our friends in the Caribbean. Sometimes we overlook our friends in Central America. You're both a Latin American and a Caribbean nation. So what would you like to see the U.S. Dominican Republic political and economic engagement look like over the next couple of years, Mr. President?
I think that we should work more closely. On the nearshoring, on investment that will be benefit for both of us. I think we also should continue to provide a good stay for millions of American tourists that come here on vacation. And for example, this year, the month of September was the best September month ever in tourism. So we are now the tourism is already recovering. I think we will have the best high season ever. So that is very important. On the industrial zone, we are exporting 30 in this year. 35% more than 2019. So it's also a good recovery. The economy is growing until the month of August to 13%, and I think it will end in double digits, between 10 to 11%. And all this, we have the main partner is United States. We are working closely as ever in the fight against narco-traffic in the region. We are also collaborating in all the institutional strength for the Dominican Republic, the fight against corruption in the country, which is going very well. And for the first time, we have independent institution on the electoral, on the judicial system. So we are a strength, and this institutional strength is also very good for the investment. So in all these aspects, security in the region, promoting democracy in the region, in all those aspects, we are working with the United States.
So, Mr. President, we are hoping to have a Summit of the Americas hosted in the United States sometime in mid-June, mid-2022. What would you like to see come out of this Summit of the Americas next year?
I think that we should work to have a new plan, a new collaboration, adapting to the new world between the United States and Latin America. That have to be a relation that should be reciprocal and positive for both. I think United States needs Latin America and Latin America needs United States. We should work also on regional organizations to promote democracy, to promote transparent elections, but at the same time also that there are a number of ways that it's not going to cost any taxpayers' money to the United States, but it even can benefit from those collaborations, and it also can help us economically in our continent. I think we should have to be creative. We now have to look for the post-pandemic world. And that post-pandemic world, we will have a lot of a situation with the economic, especially all the countries. We have to be looking now for fiscal reform. And you know that is not very popular. That will create some situations in our countries, but we need to establish a more sustainable fiscal situation in the Dominican Republic.
No, I agree.
And just to conclude, in that summit, we have to look for a creative and a special collaboration in the economic, on the promoting democracy, transparency, and fighting against corruption. I think that are three main key elements that we have to relaunch in our relation with the United States.
I very much agree with you. What do you think are the post-pandemic? You've talked about the fiscal reform issues. I think there's challenges, and there are other challenges as well. Closing the digital divide, I think that's been exacerbated. What are those challenges that it sounds to me like one of the worries I had was about travel, and were people going to travel internationally? It sounds to me like you're going to not have any problem going forward with tourism in the Dominican Republic. But how do you see these challenges? How should we think about the challenges? You've talked about fiscal reform, and there are some others as well.
Yeah, well, as you know, during this 1 year and a half of pandemic, all the countries have had to had and contract more debt, and some of the countries were already very high in debt, and sometimes it's not even the percentage of debt related to the national product, is also the cost of that debt. And if we can eliminate in some way the country risk that imposes, it's a vicious circle, because there is this country risk that add us in interest, but at the same time expose most of the risk. And I think that we should work in, as I said, in very creative type of financing, in order that we can have we can contract and refinance debt with less interest, but at the same time that has to be add and attached to some limitation in terms of fighting corruption, no impunity, and that the money that our countries, the money of the people that our country invest, has to be with transparent, with honesty, and with efficiency. So I think we can work together, promoting good government, promoting quality of life, promoting also in terms of the environment for our countries. For example, we are an Iceland. We are one of the most exposed on the change of the environment. So in all this, in the fighting against crime, international crime, I think we have to really also work together on narcotics. That all these issues, all these key problems that we have to work together, and I insist on creative ideas.
Excellent, Mr. President. The Dominican Republic is, as I said, is both a Latin American and a Caribbean nation. I'm hoping that we're going to have a renewed Caribbean Basin initiative similar to what was done under President Reagan. I think we have the first Caribbean American vice president in U.S. history, and Vice President Kamala Harris. So what are the challenges and opportunities do you see that are unique specifically to the Caribbean region, Mr. President?
Well, you know, in the Caribbean, we are part of Central America, but we are more a mix of culture. In some of our islands are in the middle of the road between Europe and also African American communities and Latin American communities. So we are really a big mix, a very interesting mix, and of cultures, of races, of ideas. So I think the ways that the United States sees us, the way that the world sees us, it has to be with a special and unique knowledge of who we are. We have a lot of things from Hispanic, Latin America, but we also have, with these 2 million Dominicans that we have in the United States, we also have a lot of influence of that culture from the United States. And then also our, during all our history, colonial history, and our Republican history, there were so many countries that had influence, starting from Spain, but also France and other colonial powers at that time. We have a mix of all that. And we are right now a consequence of all that mix of cultures and ideas. And then we have to plan and foresee a future that understand our reality, but that adapt to a modern, a more diverse, and a different world. As I insisted before, the pre-pandemic world is not the world that we should promote now. It's a post-pandemic, which is different from the pre-pandemic world. And then we have to, of all the history, with all our characteristics, we have to adapt in a good way to promote our development.
Mr. President, this has been such a great conversation. I'm so grateful that you would take time. I think we have an important partner in you. The Dominican Republic is an important partner for the United States. We have a great opportunity to partner with your administration. I'm really hopeful that the Biden-Harris administration will take full advantage of this historic opportunity. So thank you for coming and joining us today. I want to thank our audience for joining us for day one of the Global Development Forum. We hope to see all of you tomorrow at 9 a.m. for day two. Mr. President, thanks very much. Mil gracias. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Always at your disposal, and thank you for inviting me.
Muy amable. Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Gracias a ustedes.
Gracias.